Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture video. And today we'll talk about the prompt for Essay 1 and the readings for last week, which are pages 1 through I think 80 to 90 of your Arguing About Literature book. All right, so I sent you a copy of the prompt, right? And if you can't find it, I also have a copy of it in course materials on iLearn. All right, so just a couple of reminders, right? So in these lecture videos, right, obviously I'm not going to be able to talk about everything from the readings, right? I will try to just talk about things that I think are worth mentioning and are more important than others, right? But if there are parts of the readings that you want to talk about or you want me to talk about, right? Email me or ask them during the Wednesday meetings, right? Show up there and ask me to talk about certain things that I skipped, right? Or set up an office hours with me, right? So yeah, so just that. And also, when I right, so when I talk about like on the prompt, or when I'm doing my lectures on the readings or um, on the Arguing About Literature book, right? I will be giving you examples, right, from our readings, from the short story that we're reading. I'll be giving you examples and ideas um, about how to about what sort of themes, what sort of arguments to use um, in your essays, right? And these examples that I'm giving you, feel free to use them, right? Yeah. So don't feel like I talked about this in my lecture that you can't write about that same sort of idea, right? Even if you're all writing the same idea, right? Or even if you're writing about the same idea, you'll still come up with different papers, different arguments, different close readings, right? So I'm not really worried about you using my ideas, right? That's there for you to use. Um, okay, so let's just start by going through the prompt for essay 1, right? So have that prompt handy with you right now. I'll just read through it and then talk about some certain issues, right? So the first essay asks you to consider either Everything That Rises Must Converge by Flannery O'Connor or Bullet in the Brain by Tobias Wolff and produce a close reading, right? So you have to pick either one or the other. Those are your only choices. You will identify a specific issue in the story as well as pose questions regarding that issue and argue for how that issue develops the story's meaning or significance, right? So the issue, right? We will talk about that. I'll talk about that later on as I discuss arguing about literature, right? So issue just basically means you have to find questions, right? Sort of theme, I guess, from the story to sort of start to you want to find a question that you will then want to answer, right? And more to that later. Right, so that is, you will take a position in response to your chosen issue and make a claim, right? So you'll identify an issue, and then you'll make a claim, right? You'll have a question and you'll try to claim is kind of like your answer, your response, your interpretation, right, to the issue. Um, and that will be your position, right, in the essay, right? And I will also talk more about what a claim is later. You will then have to perform a close reading, right, of various passages or scenes in the short story in order to support your analysis of the issue you have chosen. Apart from using the plot surface of the story in order to support your reading, a good close reading also considers a deeper, more symbolic interpretation of the story, right? For example, one could suggest that on the surface, the mother in Everything That Rises, right, as an individual holds racist and old-fashioned beliefs, but a close reading might say that she is a mere symbol of an entire system of, American racism, right? Um, and so, because this assignment is focused on your own skills of analysis, no secondary source should be used, right? So, more than anything, right? I really look for good close readings, right? And close reading is just an engagement with the text, with bullet in the brain, or everything that rises must converge, right? The way you use the text, right, to prove your argument, to prove your claim, right? The way you use examples, the way you quote, right, and the way you analyze the quotations, right? This is what you call close reading, right? Um, and of course, I want you to have a good issue, a good claim, right? But a good paper has to perform, thoughtful close reading, right? Where you're not just analyzing what's on the surface, right? But you're sort of um, developing that surface analysis into something deeper, right? So, potential pitfalls, right, that you want to avoid, mistaking a summary for analysis, right? This is a common mistake that students tend to make, right? You want to, um, summarize things, right? Like, in a sense, you want to summarize certain parts, right, to contextualize a scene, for example, right? But summary should be at a minimum, right? The entire paper should not feel like you're just summarizing the story, right? I've already read the story, right? And so you want to um, focus on analyzing, right, instead of summarizing. So avoid cliched or obvious readings of details, right? You can mention cliched readings as long as you want to sort of uh, uh, I guess kind of turn that on its head, right? So for our essays, you should follow the 5-paragraph formulaic essay, right? The first paragraph introduces the text and your issue, right? This paragraph. So by now, you should have already taken English 1A, 1B, right? And you should be familiar with the 5-paragraph essay, right? Which is the introduction paragraph, and then the three body paragraphs, right? And then the conclusion paragraph, right? So that should be sort of like the typical way of writing an essay, right? And there are other ways of writing an essay, right? But for the sake of this class, we'll follow that structure, right? And then later on, once you've sort of familiarized that formulaic essay, then you can be more creative in the future, right? But for the sake of this class, I want you to follow that sort of 5-paragraph essay, right? Which means in the introduction you'll introduce, right, the issue, and then you'll make a claim, and then you will write a thesis, and the thesis should be the last two sentences, right, of the first paragraph, right? So I'll be looking for, when I'm grading your essay, I'll be looking for that thesis, right, on the last sentence of your first paragraph. Right? All right. So the first paragraph should conclude with a clear thesis, right, as I mentioned, that argues a point and makes a claim, right? For example, right, in Wolf's Bullet in the Brain, the character of Anders does not only act as X, but also as Y, right? So your thesis should be complex, right? So I know I'm saying that you should be familiar with thesis, with the formula of the essay, right? But I know that some of you um, might not have or took your composition class a long time ago. And so if you're worried about the formula or the how to write a thesis, right, you should really read the examples, right, on arguing about literature or meet with me, right, or show up in one of the Wednesday meetings, right. That's really the only way that I can kind of walk you through it, right, is if you meet with me, right. Um, so if you're not contacting me about any of these issues, then I'll just assume that you are familiar with the formula and how to write a thesis, right. Of course, I will be giving examples too. Right, so, and then body paragraphs should begin with topic sentences that argue a part of the thesis, right? These paragraphs should prove their claims by quoting the text and then analyzing the quotes to explain how they function and support, right? Each body paragraph should end with a concluding sentence that explains how it relates to the thesis. The essay should conclude with a final paragraph that explains how the body arguments come together to prove the thesis and the significance of the claims made in the essay, right? And so on the body paragraphs, I will be looking for quotations, right? I want to see that you know how to quote, you know how to introduce quotations in various ways, right? Um, yeah, and you know how to interact with the quotations, right? You're not just quoting for the sake of quoting, right? You want to quote to give us a proof that this happened in the story, right? And then you want to give us an analysis of that quotation, right? This is what happened in this quote, right? And this is why it supports my claim, right? Um, so that's what I mean. You know, when I'm grading your paper, and I don't see any quotations, right? That's usually a fail for me, right? Easy, like easy fail, if I don't see any quotations, right? So you want to really, you know, because that's my way of knowing that, you know, you have read the text and you understand the text and you're engaging with the text, right? By using quotations. Right, so keep in mind you're writing an essay that is analytical and persuasive. You need to take a position and argue a point of view, right? Not merely summarize the text without offering evidence to support your argument, right? An original position, opinion about its meaning or significance. Evidence comes from the text itself. Please remember that grammatical, coherent, logical writing is also the minimum requirement for a passing grade, right? Points will be deducted from essays that are incoherent and make significant numbers of grammatical errors, right? Like I said, I'm not too strict on grammar, right? If you have some grammatical issues here and there, that's fine. But if there's just too many of them to a point where it's distracting for me and I don't understand what's going on because of grammatical errors, then we have a problem, right? Um, if you're not confident about you know, your use of grammar or your English writing. We have resources, the academic resource centers, or have somebody, have a friend read it for you. You read it, proofread it. Don't write it on the day before it's due, right? Try to write it ahead of time so you have time to let it sit and then read it again, because it's usually the second or the third or fourth time that you read it where you start seeing the grammatical issues, the mistakes, right? So proofreading is really key, right? Or setting up a meeting with me, and then I can walk you through, certain issues that you you might have with your paper, right? And then the second page of the prompt, these are just additional informations on how to structure your paper, right? So I'm not going to go through them. You go through them, right? And make sure that you're following every, like I broke it down for you here, in detail, like what I'm looking for on the introduction, what I'm looking for in the body paragraphs, right? What I'm looking for in the conclusion, right? So again, this paper is at least 1,100 words, right? Try not to go over 200 words, right? If, try to do 1,100 to 1,300, right? 1,300 should be the ultimate maximum, right? Anything more than 1,300 is too much, too long, and I will start deducting grade from that. MLA format, right? No outside research for this paper, but I still encourage you to maybe, read an article about Tobias Wolff if you're writing, for example, about bullet in the brain, right? So I still encourage you to read, um, articles and stuff that will help you, generate ideas, right? But you are not required, or you should not use outside materials for this specific paper, right? So no works cited page for this paper, right? And it's due Sunday, November 1st. So let's talk about chapter 1 of Arguing About Literature, right? Excuse me. All right. So, chapter 1 is what is an argument, right? Um, I'm going to read the first kind of paragraph here, just to give us a little context of what this chapter is about. So the first word in our book's title may puzzle you, right? Why would we want you to argue? Are we really inviting you to yell or sneer? Right. The word arguing may remind you of spats you regret, right? Almost everyone has suffered arguments like these. They arise in the media all the time. Cable news panels routinely lapse into squabbles. Guests feel required to clash. Social media outlets like Twitter are plagued with trolls, accounts that exist to insult and demean other people's posts. Celebrities may rebuke each other on Instagram. No wonder many people define arguing as a combat, right? It often seems like war. But our book is about arguing in a positive sense, right? We define it as a calm, courteous process in which A, you identify a subject of current or possible debate, right? Analyze why you view the subject the way you do, address others who may not share your view, and try to persuade them that your view is worth accepting or at least makes sense, right? Um, so yeah, so I don't know. Maybe that should be obvious, right? That what we do, like in sort of the academic context, right, in terms of arguing, um, is something that should be sort of um, civil, right? Because you want your readers to not be caught up, right, um, in the sort of like uh, in the combativeness, I guess, of your arguments, right? You want your readers to understand the depths of your arguments, right, and the depths of your position in order, maybe not necessarily to convince them or to make them believe your way, right? But to sort of to at least understand where you're coming from, right? Um, and so when texts are too aggressive, too informal, too like I said, combative, right? readers usually don't even take the time to read it because they'll judge it immediately and blah blah blah, right? Um, so the point here is to get your message across in a clear and coherent way, um, and yeah, and so that's what we do here, right? So a good argument about literature, right? So we're arguing about literature. We're using literature as a means through which we sort of express our argument, right? Um, and really, this means just it's we're making interpretations, right? So we read something, we read a story, and each person, right, read that story and interpret that story based on what they know and how they see the world and this and that, right? So we have different interpretations, right? There's similar kind of like surface interpretation. This happened to Anders, and then Anders got killed, and then this happened, right? So there's that. But in terms of what it really means on a deeper surface, on a deeper level, right? Um, we usually have different ideas, right? This is a story that teaches a lesson, right? This is a story that criticizes this, right? Um, so we have different ways of making sense of it, right, in a deeper level, um, and and so what you're doing, right, is arguing that your interpretation is a good interpretation, a superior interpretation, right, and then you'll prove why, right. So that's basically what you're arguing about when arguing about literature, right. So to argue is to disagree, right? Not in order to win, right? Or but in order to inquire, right? So I'm not interested in you coming up with some grand answer about something, right? It's like I figured it out. This is what this means, right? Um, what we do is inquire and examine, right? And make people think, right? And so your argument should not be to answer an absolute question, right? Or should not be to provide, right, an absolute answer, right? It should just be to like make your reader think even further, right? That maybe they thought about it a certain way, but now that they've read your paper, right, they see your point of view, and now you have them rethinking what the story means to them because you've somehow convinced them that your argument is also valid, right? So that's the point, right? We're not trying to change the world here, right? We're just trying to question things, right? Okay, so let's go to um, elements of um, elements of an argument, right? So this is when we're going to start talking about what issues are, um, what a claim is. Okay, so I'm on page 6 now. So on page 7, you get this diagram, right, of the structure of the essay, right? And so you have the issue at the very top, the main claim, and then you'll have smaller claims, and then you'll have your evidence and reasoning, right? And then your assumptions, and then your appeals, right? And then, you know, uh, your audience, right? So this is kind of the structure of your essay too, right? On the first paragraph in the introduction, you'll want to pose um, the issue, right? The question that you're trying to answer, and then you give us your main claim, right? So um, so what is an issue, right? So an issue is a question not yet settled, right? That's what's written on here. Um, so for example, right, in bulletin brain, you might want to ask, what is the function between, or what is the function of the juxtaposition of ideas of beauty and science, right, in uh, Tobias Wolff's Bullet in the Brain, right? And so that's an actual question, right? Because as we know, uh, the idea of beauty, right, and Anders's idea of beauty that exists kind of in this outer realm for him, right? It doesn't exist in the real world, right? Um, that's there, right? Greek mythology and all of that, right? That's part of the story, right? But then we also get a part of the story where the tone of the narrator becomes very scientific, right? When the bullet goes into the brain and the terms that were being used, it's very, you know, it's very earthly. It's very sort of um, it's very medical, right? And so in the sense, it's very sort of bodily, right? Um, and so in that sense, we also have that scientific tone into the story, right? So so an issue, right, might be what is the point, right, of having those two things, something abstract and beautiful and outer realm, right, and then something scientific and bodily and sort of earthly, right? So you might want to ask, like, what's the point of having those two sort of ideas, right, in the story, right? So that could be your issue. That could be your question, right? Um, and when you think about an issue, right, it should not be something that has one answer, right, or something that can be answered absolutely, right. It should be kind of a question that has various answers, right, or just can't be answered at all. Like, there's just no way that we will ever know the actual answer, right. But it's a real question that you can sort of address, right, or you can offer an answer to, right? Which is not going to mean that your answer will be perfect, right? But it's an interpretation. So that's the issue, right? And I will talk more about different kinds of issues, right, later on in the, I think that's in chapter 3. All right, so main claim. The main claim is a statement that is spoken or written so that people will think it true, right? So this is your interpretation. So you have your question and then your answer, right? How are you going to address this question, right? What is your point of view, right? Um, so you could say, right, for example, I read the juxtaposition of ideas of beauty and science in Bullet in the Brain as as criticism of any absolute belief of on either ideology, right? Something like that. Um, so right, so you're offering an interpretation, you're offering an answer, what you think is the answer to this question, right? So these are what so these are the things that I'll be looking for, right, in the first um, in the introduction, right? Also, I want in on the introduction, I want you to mention um, the name of the author and the short story that you're writing about, right? So that's your way of telling us that you will be writing about Bullet in the Brain by Tobias Wolff, right? So you'll just kind of weave that into the introduction, right? Maybe even your thesis, right? You'll just say something like, in Tobias Wolff's, and I want to see the full name of the author and the full title, right? In the first paragraph in the introduction. You can do that in the thesis or in the first sentence of your introduction, wherever, as long as it's in the introduction, right? So it should go like, in Tobias Wolff's Bullet in the Brain, the issue of beauty and science, blah, 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 right? So So I want to see that, right? And then later on in your essay, you can just use his last name, right? Wolf argues that blah blah, right? But in the introduction, full name, full title, right? So chapter two, I won't go through this too much because this is mostly this has to do with style, right? And style comes with time and experience, right? The more you read, the more you sort of familiarize yourself with how sentences are being written, right? And then you come up with your own style, right? And and that's hard to do. That takes practice, right? And so I'm not going to focus too much on style, right? But I will say this. The more you read, then the more you just kind of imitate other people's styles, right? And I'm not saying to kind of to plagiarize, right? I'm saying to take the structure of sentences that you've read, right, and then copy that structure, right, the kind of the structure of the sentence, and then insert your own words, right. That's what I usually do when I'm like stuck and like I don't know how to um, make something sound good, right? I just pick a sentence that I feel like, oh, this is a good sentence. And then I follow the structure, the flow of the sentence, the syntax, right? And then I just put in my own words, right? Um, so that's just, an example of, or you can use, some words here and there. But you should, put your own ideas into that, right? Not just copy the whole thing, right? Just copy the structure. So yeah, that's what I do sometimes. um, but let's like look at a couple of sample sentences here, right? On page 28. Right. So there's sample sentences here, right, that I want you to look at. So um, on the middle of the page, 28, balance the parts of the sentence, right? So for example, right, here's one that says, when you are in a forest, you want to experience its woodsiness. When you are on a beach, you want to feel connected to sand and surf, right? And then the second example, contrast Tom Ridge's world of 1969 with that of America's combat soldiers of today, right? And so what balancing means is that you're just giving us two parts of the sentence that sort of balances each other out, right? Or you're explaining two sort of parallel ideas or two parallel information, right? Um, yeah, so like things like that, right? If you feel like you need a sentence, I mean, you don't have to like do that, like your all of your sentences like that. Yeah, that's too much. But like every once in a while, right? You want to sort of um, show me that you've um, you know how to write these kinds of sentences, right? Yeah, so you just wanted to take that sort of that formula, that structure, right? Where you say something and then you use a semicolon and then say another thing that balances that statement out, right? And they have to be kind of related to each other in order for that to work, right? Um, yeah, so when you're in the forest, and then the second one is when you are on a beach, right? So that kind of like gives us two different landscapes, right? And then contrast Tom Ridge's world, right, to soldiers of today, right? So yeah, if you want to work on that, and then notice also, right? I talked about alliteration before, the repetition of consonants, right? It gives the sentence a kind of rhythm, right? So notice here, right? When you're in a forest, you want to experience its woodsiness. So repetition of W's here. When, want woodsiness, right? So that gives it a certain kind of rhythm, right? And then when you're on a beach, you want to feel connected to sand and surf, right? Repetition of s there, right? Sand and surf, right? That gives it a kind of rhythm, right? So little details like that, right, are appreciated, right? It just makes the reading all the more pleasurable. Right? So that's really it. But also look at bottom of page 29, right? Um, there are words here, right? Terms that you can use, right? And this is the terms that you should be using in your argument, right? When you're arguing something, you should use words like, argues, right? Right. I argue that, I claim that, I contend that, right? So these are just kind of, synonyms of terms that you want to use to assert yourself, right? So urges, demands, requests, analyzes, examines, studies, right? All these things. So that you're not only using I argue, I argue, I argue, right? You want to use other synonyms so it doesn't sound repetitive, right? So use this vocabulary to kind of to give us a little variety, right, in your argument. All right, so the last chapter that I'm going to talk about today is chapter 3, how to argue about literature, right? Um, I guess so. I guess we should start by asking, right? What is literature, right? Um, and there's a great debate, right? Uh, that question, right, is an issue of debate, right? Because there's no one absolute answer to that, right? So for the sake of definition, I looked up the meaning of literature, right, from Oxford English Dictionary, and it says here, right, familiarity with letters or books, knowledge acquired from reading or studying books, especially the principal classical texts, right, associated with humane learning, literary culture, learning scholarship. This is a branch of study, right? So this definition is not wrong, right? But it's a very sort of traditional and old school definition of literature. Sometimes they'll make a difference between capital L literature and then lowercase literature, right? And lowercase literature is supposed to mean anything that's written, right? Anything that we see that's written is literature, right? Letters, dictionary meanings, right? Anything that you can read, literally anything that you can read, is literature. Capital L literature, on the other hand, right, um, tends to have something to do with the great works of great men or women, right, in history, right? Something that has sort of that follows a certain tradition, right, and that has proven itself to be beautiful, right, based on the standards of that tradition, right. Um, and there's some truth to that, right, but also um, there are some gaps to that, right, because usually, like, who gets considered um, high literature, right, capital L literature, um, are people in positions of power, right? So those who um, are educated, right? Those who can afford to be educated, those whose parents, right, have taught them what the tradition is, right? Those who sort of um, those who grew up in societies or in the context where people are also reading the same books and this and that, right? Um, so it's also a very kind of elitist, right, space, and so in that sense, are are books that are written by those who do not have that privilege. Are they not high literature then? Right. I would argue that they are. Right. And so that idea of literature also is questionable. Right. Um, right. So for the sake of this class, I guess, um, are the short stories that I've chosen, right? These are considered literature, right? Um, on the one hand, they sort of follow certain traditions, right? I would consider all of them high literature because they follow, certain standards of writing, right? But on the other hand, they also disrupt, right, that traditional idea of literature, right? So I guess why study literature, right? Um, I guess practically, right? We are all, whatever your pursuit is, whether in the sciences, in politics, in the humanities, right? Um, Even if you're working at HR or whatever, right? A lot of I guess whatever your field is, right? It's most likely that you're going to be encounter some form of research, right? In while you're in school, but also in once you start working, right? You will be asked to do a research about something, whatever your field is, right? And in that research, you will be asked to do field work, perhaps, right? To go somewhere and find out, what's going on, read something and find out what's going on, right? And then summarize that information, right, in a way that's coherent and concise, right? Um, and then you're supposed to analyze, right? Like, what does this mean? What does this data mean, right? Analyze that data, right, and give us a deeper analysis, right? Not just, oh, these are the numbers, right? But like, what do these numbers mean, right? In terms of whatever, right? Whatever your purpose is, right? And how do we think about these numbers, blah blah, right? Um, yeah, so that's kind of like the typical structure of any research from any field, right? And really, that's what we're doing here, right? We're practicing that capacity to um, to to gather data, to gather information, right? And then put that information in a certain way, right? And then um, ask questions about why. Okay, first of all, you want to like, you should have a reason why you're gathering those information, right? And then you gather the information, summarize them, synthesize them, and then analyze them, right? And then give us your position on what this information mean, right? Yeah, so basically that's what we're doing here, right? And we're using literature as as the subject of analysis, right? And for me, like someone who, I'm a PhD student, and so I do research. All I do is research, right? So I'm always like reading and reading and reading, right? You can see all the books here that I'm supposed to be reading all the time. Um, and then I'm always, coming up with ideas and how to summarize them and then analyze them, right? Um, so that's what we do, right? So in terms of research, this will really help you, right? In that practical sense, right? But also, on a kind of individual human level, right? When you're reading literature, right, you're thinking not only about what's going on in the surface, um, of things, right? On the surface of yourself and the way we think, on the surface of people and the way they think and act, and what's going on around us, right? Um, and so I guess if you think about it every day, right, when you interact with your mind or when you interact with people around you, right, you're always interpreting things, right? What does my mind, right? What does my mind want? Why am I thinking like this, right? Why do I have these desires, right? And then you interact with other people. Why are they saying these things, right? Why do they act like this, right? You interact with different kinds of people. You get different kinds of, you know, different. You get different characters, right? It's like the world is really just a big stage, right? And so you are forced, right, to interpret every day everything that happens to you in your mind and outside of your, in yourself and outside of yourself, right? Um, and the more you sort of understand, right, through literature, through observation, the more you understand, the structure of how we think, and the more you understand the structure of how some people think, and the more you familiarize yourself, because we can't know everybody, right? And that's why we read, because it's only through reading that we get to know, someone like Anders, right? And then later on, we're gonna meet a racist old lady from Georgia, right? And then later on, we're gonna meet um, a Bengali immigrant, and then later on we're going to meet a black gay man, right? And then later on we're going to meet, you know, Filipinos in this small town in the Philippines, right? These are the only thing reading, right? Unless you're very well traveled and you meet a lot of different people and this and that, right? Reading is really the only way that we can familiarize ourselves with other people that we might not otherwise meet, right? Um, and so by familiarizing ourselves with different people, different kinds of people, and different ways of being, different ways of thinking, right, then we're better equipped, I think, to make interpretations of the world, right, in a sympathetic way, right, and to make sort of adjustments in how we treat people, and and how we think of ourselves and this and that, right? So that that was my literature rant. Um, that to me, I think, is the is the deeper importance, right, of reading literature, of studying literature, right, and yeah, and so whether your purpose is practical, right, and just to get a job and do your job well, or existential, right, or philosophical. Um, you want to read literature because you want to understand certain things about yourself and about other people. Then you can't lose, right? Um, so yeah, so that's why we do what we do here, right? Um, anyway, so let's talk about let's talk about the different types of issues, right? So like, how do we think about issues? Um, let's look at page. Okay, so on chapter 3, you will also get a very short story here called Girl by Jamaica Kincaid, right? And I suggest you read this short story. It's a very short story. It's on page 47. Right. It's a very fascinating short story. So read that short story, and then there's a sample essay that about this short story. Right. I will not talk about that sample essay in this video. I will make a separate video because this is going to be too long now. I will make a separate video just talking about the sample essay, and I'm going to break down for you, what's going on there, right? And as an example of how a paper should be, right? Um, I will do a separate video for that, and I will post that either Tuesday, tomorrow, or Wednesday, right? Yeah, just because this is getting too long now. But read Girl, page 47 by Jamaica Kincaid. And then obviously you're supposed to read the whole chapter anyway. So okay, so let's talk about issues first, right? Different issues. Right, so on page 50, we have how many? 1, 2, 6, 7, 9, 10. So there's like 10 different kinds of issues here, right? So there's so many things that you can think about or you can approach, right, your issue, right? So let's go just one by one on this, right? So there's an issue of fact, right? So issues of fact, that means, this is a short story. Bullet in the Brain, for example, is a very short story. So we get information, right? What's going on, right? This is Anders. This is what he does for a living. He's in a bank, right? So there are factual things that are in the story, but because it's a short story, they can't really cover everything, right? So there are gaps. There are facts that are left out, right? And in literature, what's left out, right, is usually just as important, if not more important. That's than what's on the surface, right? So what's left out, you can make assumptions, right, you know, about Anders as a character, right? Because this is what's being said here, but actually what's not being said is blah blah, which makes Anders, this, right? So that's an issue of facts, right? And there's one of you suggested, right, that there could be a queer reading of Anders, right? That Anders might be queer or gay, um, and I don't know. I'm not convinced based on my reading. I don't think there's enough evidence to suggest, right, that Anders is queer. But if you can prove it to me, right, I'm happy to be proven wrong. If you can prove it to me by mapping out patterns that make you think, right. It's obviously not explicitly said that Anders is queer, right? But if you think that there's something about Anders that makes him queer, right, then I'm happy to be wrong, right? So something like that, right? Things that are not there, but you feel like it's hinted at, right? As long as you can provide me with strong argument and a strong sort of um, I guess like strong defense, right? All right. There's also the issue of the theme, right? What do you think is the lesson, right, that the author is trying to teach, right? Or is there a lesson, right? What's the point of this story, right? Is there a point? Is its main purpose just to fuck with you, right? or make you think, right? And sometimes that's enough, just to make you feel uncomfortable, right? That's a point in itself, right? um, and then issues of definition, right? Here you literally uh, taking right certain words, right, and suggesting what those words mean, right? So for example, the title "Bullet in the Brain," right? It sounds cool because you have the two B's there, bullet in the brain, right? So it has that rhythm. But what does that mean? Like, why did he choose, like, of all the titles of all the words, right? Why bullet in the brain? Right. It seems like a very precise statement, right? That there's a bullet in the brain, right? What do you think that means, right? And so you can take that and the definition of these words, or a word or a group of words, right, and then make assumptions into what that might mean in terms of the story um, as a whole, right? All right, and there's also the issue of symbolism, right? So, issue of symbolism. Let's think about the setting, right? The bank, right? Why the bank? Like of all the places, why did this happen in the bank, right? Obviously, there's a robbery. It makes it sort of uh, fitting, right, for a robbery, right? I guess. But is there other symbolic ways of thinking about the bank? What is the bank? Is it like it's a very sort of it's a it's a staple institution in society, right? Where money is involved, right? Maybe has something to do with capitalist America, maybe. I don't know, right? So that's up to you to take symbols, right, and then make suggestions and what they might mean, right? Greek mythology, right? The painting that was on the ceiling of the bank. What does that mean? What? How does that work in the story, right? Um, the scientific terms, the medical terms that were being used to describe, the brain and the parts of the brain as the bullet is going in, right? What are the significance of using these very terms, right? A lot of us, some of you are in the sciences or in the medical field, so you're familiar with these terms, right? But to those of us who are not, right, these words don't really mean anything to us, right? But why do you think he chose these terms? Why are these words symbolic, right? So that's the issue of symbols, right? Issues of pattern, right? Pattern. So think about time, for example, in Bullet in the Brain, right? The first part is a forward movement of time, right, where uh, Anders walked into the bank, and then you know things happened, robbery happened, and then he got shot, right? And then the second part seems to be, to me, a movement backwards in time, right? Backwards into his memory, up until his child, back all the way back to his childhood, right? Marriage, children, childhood, right? So there seems to be that sort of um, two opposing movements of time, right? But then there's also that moment in the middle, right, where time kind of stopped, right? So there's that millisecond supposedly that these memories come flooding in before a person dies, right? So for a mere second, right, time kind of stopped where he's able to remember all of these things, right? So what is that pattern, right? You might want to sort of think about what that pattern means, right, in terms of how time works, right? Um, let's see. And then issues of evaluation, right? Is there kind of like an ethical, philosophical, or aesthetic um, kind of um, theme, right? That the story is doing, right? Uh, Bullet in the Brain deconstructs traditional ideas of um, narrative and time, right? Maybe. So that would be an issue of, ethical or philosophical kind of issue. Um, Bullet, like I mentioned this, I think, in my last lecture, Bullet in the Brain, somehow has kind of a capital R romantic um, narrative to it, right? So you might want to say Bullet succeeds as a romantic, if it is as a romantic narrative, because blah blah blah, right? So that would be you would be thinking there about issues of aesthetic, right? Um, and then issues of historical context, right? And I will, for this one, I will use some of you probably haven't read Flannery O'Connor's stories at this point, but in everything in her story, everything that rises must converge. It's sort of set in post World War II civil rights movement sort of era, right, before the Cold War. Um, and so that's a good example of how you might want to use the historical context, right, in making argument. And then issue of cause and effect, right? So in Bullet in the Brain, think about, Anders and what caused him, uh, like what he did, right? And then why he got shot, right? So he did something and then he suffered the consequence, right? Um, and so there's that cause and effect. But then, that's obvious, right? That, he did something stupid and he got shot. But then to develop that, right, you might want to say, what is the relationship between that pattern, that cause and effect, to the sort of to the structure of the story, right? Where there's like one part and then there's a second part, right? So you might want to connect that, and then that would be, a way of developing that idea of cause and effect, right? So yeah, so I think I'll stop there because this is too long now. And then I will have another video tomorrow or Wednesday, and I will talk about what a claim is, right? I will talk about the sample essay. I will go through every paragraph and then, make sure that you understand what I'll be looking for, how to make a claim, right? This and that, right? Um, okay, so that's it for now, and I'll see you in the next video.